So good morning. Good morning to those who are joining us from off the island as well. Yesterday afternoon we looked at the work of meditation that we do in detail, and of the radical simplicity that this work involves, and that this radical simplicity is the condition in which the saving spiritual knowledge, which is not knowing about something, but knowing with something, that radical spiritual knowledge arises and saves or heals or unifies us. And we're revolving around a certain number of themes in these reflections, which I hope are being connected. And it brings us back to the central theme of unity. The early Christian mystics like Julian of Norwich and the Cloud of Unknowing speak about prayer in this sense as a way of oneing, a way of unification, of becoming simple again. The simple is one. And the whole theology of Easter is built upon the same fundamental idea that this work of Jesus that is being undergone through his life, his passion, his death, and of course in his resurrection, that this whole work of Jesus is a kind of prayer. It's the work of prayer bringing about the reconciliation of God and man, this reintegration, this healing of this fundamental split that we looked at yesterday morning, that all the great mythologies, all the great religious insights have intuited some kind of flaw or dislocation or disharmony within the human soul, within our relationship to the world and our relationships to each other, not to say our relationship to God, and that yet this fundamental flaw can be repaired or reintegrated. And in the Christian vision, this is the meaning of redemption, of salvation, of liberation. And in fact, of course, the good news is that we're not just getting a patch-up job. Actually, we are getting a new model, that this repairing of the broken instrument gives us a better tool, a better instrument, a better way of being than we had before. Oh, happy fault of Adam. So I'd like to look a little bit more at this question of simplicity and unity, because it really does take us to that place where we can see the connection, I hope, between our meditation and the meaning of the Easter story that we are living and thinking about these days. Western philosophy at least began with the sense of wonder that we can look at the world and say it is the world, and yet at the same time the world is made up of an apparently infinite number of different things. This is the great philosophical conundrum of the one and the many. There seems to be an infinity of individual objects, and yet at the same time we can sense a unity among them. And if we just spend 5 minutes looking through old photographs of ourselves or our family, we get a sense of this. We look at our old selves, we say, did I really look like that? And yet we say, that is me. That's me in that picture. We don't say that was me, that is me. So there's a sense of continuity, a real unity of our existence, our identity, our being, however much we change. There is one person involved who is changing. And yet at the same time, there is this mystery of diversity, difference. And so there has always been this tension or paradox between the one and the many, and as we contemplate the many, we can easily get lost in all of that diversity. We can be overwhelmed by the number of things we have to do or the number of things we can do. And yet at the same time there is a sense deep in all the great spiritual traditions that everything can be related back to a single source. It's come from something, someone, and it's on its way back into that unity. In the Chinese wisdom, the Tai Chi is the great ultimate, the great unifying reality. And yet the Tao is made up of yin and yang, the two opposites, and their constant interaction, and the dance of these opposites makes up the unity. In modern science, I think it was Einstein who first launched the idea of the search for a unified field theory, that there is an answer to this mystery of the one and the many, and scientifically speaking, we can find or we search for some theory or some answer which contains the fundamental forces of the universe and all the elementary particles, and they can all be conceived as a single field, a great simplicity. So even in the scientific mind, we're hungering for or searching for this simplicity, this unity, as a result of our encounter with the diversity of life, the changes of life. Some years ago, when I was visiting the Caribbean, I went to give some talks on a little island, and I went for a walk on this island, and it's kind of shaped a bit like a egg timer, and the waste of the the central, the physical waste of the island was a very narrow little piece of land. It was a sort of little bridge. And on one side there was the Atlantic, sort of the heavy, surging, deep grey Atlantic. And on the other side was the Caribbean. And it was this beautiful aquamarine, shallow, beautiful, calm water of the Caribbean. And the Atlantic was pouring in through a small hole in this waste into the Caribbean, but the Caribbean, the calmness of the Caribbean was just absorbing this influx of the Atlantic. So the human mind notices these contrasts, these dualities, these oppositions, perhaps because the human mind itself is made up of these dualities. It seems to be a dualistic system, working as the computer, our great reflection of the human mind, or attempt to reflect the human mind, or mimic the human mind, our computers, working on the two binary digits of 0 and 1. A binary code assigns what is called a bit string to each symbol or instruction that you're putting into the program. Adriano, please don't laugh at me as I say this. And so, for example, a binary system of 8 binary digits can express any of 256 possible values. Now, if you don't understand that, don't worry. If you do understand it, please let me know afterwards. But the point being made is that with this basic binary or system or duality, we end up with an infinite number of possibilities. So we start with simplicity, and we end up with a great complexity, an infinite complexity. Simplicity is one. There's no compromise on that. As soon as we divide, we lose simplicity, and we find complexity. Now, the brain has two hemispheres, we know. The theory used to be that the left hemisphere handled things like maths and logic and business reports, and the right hemisphere was more intuitive, more poetic. It's the right side of the brain that writes haikus, for example. This theory, giving such different functions to the two hemispheres, is less strong today than it was in the past, because we know that even very logical processes work better when the intuitive side of the brain is involved. We have two brains, in a sense, but we work best when we are single-minded. The two hemispheres communicate through a thick band of many millions of nerve fibers, and so these two oppositions, these two opposites, are constantly in communication. And when they are in communion, in balance, we feel better, we feel whole, we feel peaceful, and we act from that experience of communion, of unity. So we seem to be dualistic beings. This is how we explain, define, and discuss the world: left and right, good and bad, light and dark, sweet and sour, soft and hard, strong and weak, beautiful and ugly, young and old, dead or alive. And we use these dualities to organize the way we see the world, to give it sense, to make sense when we have a conversation with another person about something. That's how we are, that's what we're doing. We're using these dualities to come to a conclusion or come to an assessment of the rights and wrongs, or the usefulness or lack of usefulness of a particular situation. And this seems to be how we naturally understand the world. And if we approach the world, reality, experience, in a different way, if we approach it looking rather at the unity or the transcendence of that duality, it sounds a bit odd. At least it would at a business meeting, or perhaps even if you're having medical tests. We have actually separated, also, another duality, we've separated these two ways of looking at the world, the Mary and the Martha, the active and the contemplative, the intuitive and integral, or the analytical and the rationalistic. If we add the body-mind duality to all of this, then we've defined ourselves quite totally in this dualistic way. And then we end up making a duality between God and creation, and that's it. We are now completely dualistic. The meaning of the Easter story that we are opening ourselves to, and that meditation attunes us to, challenges this duality. challenges this normal and in a way necessary, but also questionable single view of reality. I mean, the resurrection itself questions the difference between death and life, between God and man. We often blame the French philosopher Descartes for institutionalizing this duality in modern science and modern philosophy. He saw the mind as something immaterial. But science has not proved that that point of view at all. Science works on it, but it hasn't proved it. It's despite the fact that it's not proven, it has also done a lot of, invented a lot of interesting and wonderful things using that point of view, but it hasn't been proven. We are dualistic beings then, but we are also dualistic beings with an aspiration to unity. And for the Christian, we might say we are dualistic beings with an aspiration to the Trinity. The Christian model of God has a duality, the Father-Son duality, but it has it bridged and unified, genuinely unified, without beginning or end. There is no beginning or end, which is another obvious duality in God. So the Father doesn't come first, and then the Son comes a few seconds later, and then the Holy Spirit comes a few seconds after that. The model of the Trinity is that this is an eternal, timeless, continuously present reality. And these two polarities, the yin and the yang of the Father and the Son, are unified by the Holy Spirit, which the New Testament applies to ordinary life. This all sounds very abstract until you read the New Testament, and then we see that this Holy Spirit is what comes into the world in a new way, anyway, comes into the world, into human experience, and touches the deepest common ground of our human consciousness, human being, as a result of the Easter story. There's a bit of a time lapse. We have 50 days between the resurrection and Pentecost. Time to get over the trauma and to begin to understand the outcome, the resurrection. But then the story doesn't end. The story ends with the sending of the Holy Spirit, which Jesus said it was necessary for him to go away for the Holy Spirit to come. So the meaning of the Easter story takes us in a Christian understanding. We could look at it psychologically and mythologically or philosophically or in terms of the history of religions and so on. But if we look at it theologically, if we look at it spiritually, then the story, the meaning of this story takes us into the heart of God and of this understanding or intuition about God. Of course, it's only a working model, but it's the one we have. The New Testament sees the Holy Spirit as this principle of unity in everything, and also as the great power that liberates us from the prison of duality, from the two-dimensional set of contradictions that we are otherwise stuck in. To be in a dualistic vision or understanding of the world is to be in prison. It is deeply frustrating and unsatisfying. We long to escape from that. It's the human aspiration to rise beyond the dualistic. Liberation, salvation, enlightenment, transcendence, all of these are different terms for what opens us to the non-dualistic. That's what we call the spirit, the world of non-duality, which is the kingdom of heaven. Now, within this new world that we can live in, and live in more freely, the gospel is a program for human liberation. In this new world, for anyone united to Christ, there is a new creation, we're told. That in this new world, you still have computers. You still have the binary system, still doing useful, practical things. You still have to fill up your car if you want it to work. But we no longer identify ourselves with this dualistic mechanism. In other words, we're no longer trapped within a materialistic and antagonistic view of the world. And that makes a big difference, actually, not just to our ideas, but to the way we live. It changes the way we see the world and how we exploit it. It makes a difference in where we find the true values of our life, and it makes a difference to the way we communicate with each other and handle our conflicts. For example, if you look at what's happening again in the Ukraine and Russia and the West, we see, the age-old pattern of conflict. It's the same, the same story but new actors, just continuously repeated situations of conflict and of, with one party on one side and another on the other, and clashing and unable, unless there's usually until they run out of ammunition, they rarely come to a true agreement. In religious thinking, dualism sees the world as the outcome and the battleground of two eternally opposed principles of good and evil, dark and light. Many of the great myths, ancient myths of creation, use this conflict of good and evil, light and dark, God and the devil. This view of the world, of course, existed long before the Christian era, and it was so deeply established in religious thinking that it naturally began to influence this newly born Christian way of thinking that grew out of the Easter story, that grew out of this mysterious experience of the resurrection and this even more mysterious experience of liberty and joy in daily life, the freedom from the fear of death, the new way of looking at your neighbor. That was the result of the experience of the Spirit. So this very fledgling, small little Christian community, not surprisingly, began to be influenced by this old way of looking at the world, which was fundamentally opposed to it. Because the new Christian way of living was based upon this vision of unity, an experience of unity, not at this stage, there wasn't much of a Christian theology or Christian philosophy of unity, but it was an experience. See how these Christians love one another. We have what might seem a rather idealized description of the early Christian community in Jerusalem in the Acts of the Apostles, where they lived and prayed together, and if one person needed something, that need would be met by the others in the community. So we have this image of a new way of living. That's the early monastic movement was inspired by that and tried to relive it. It's what St. Benedict tries to achieve. It's what the Christian idea of the family also tries to achieve, is this way of living together which proceeds from an experience of love, of unity, rather than of conflict and opposition. So the early Christian church, of course, and the thinkers then had to deal with this powerful influence of the dualistic and the Gnostic view of the world, and the church fathers rose to the challenge, and they fought long and hard to prevent Christianity from being taken over by this dualism. And they protected, and of course in the process developed, the Trinitarian model of God. It didn't deny the existence of evil in the world, but it did deny equality, the equality of good and evil. Our deeper understanding of Jesus is shaped, of course, in this experience of the Spirit, this experience of unity, of transcendent unity. That's why we're told we can only know the Lord in the Spirit. If we think from a dualistic point of view of Jesus, we just end up with a sort of black and white dualistic individual. The idea that he is fully God and fully human seems absurd. The right and the left hemispheres of the brain individually cannot compute this. Something has to be either 50-50 or 70-30 or whatever. It can't be 100% one and 100% the other. But spiritual knowledge, as we were talking about yesterday, which arises from this radical simplicity of our prayer, be still and know that I am God, this spiritual knowledge recognizes the truthfulness of these apparently absurd statements. So, you listen to TV debate between, an intellectual atheist and maybe a not very articulate bishop, who's trying to defend the Christian point of view, and you see that, they're throwing bits of chalk and bits of cheese at each other. There's just really very little meeting of minds. Everything we think about the truth, of course, that we experience in the spiritual realm, when we speak about it, of course, it has to be through words, through images, and through metaphors. Some metaphors are much more liberating and enlightening than others. The image of God as a judge sitting on a throne high above us is one metaphor for God, but a much more interesting and revealing metaphor would be the image of the early church, which preceded the crucifixion really, as the major image of Christ, which is the young shepherd carrying the lost sheep on his shoulders. Here are two very different images, metaphors, both of them metaphors. God is not a judge on a throne, and nor is God a shepherd with a sheep on his shoulders, but these metaphors communicate different things. Some are, and we might say, better than another. Nevertheless, maybe because we've been fed too many of the wrong metaphors and fed them in the wrong way, many Christians became functioning dualists. In other words, they see the world as this perennial battle between God and the devil, and it just goes on. There's an easy way of seeing the world and explaining what happens, which you read in the newspapers. So the fundamentalist Christian is, very quick to demonize someone. Remember when Gorbachev was called the beast? I forget what he's called anyway. Because he had this birthmark on his forehead, So he was. That was very clear. He's definitely a devil. And I'm sure some of you have had conversations with fundamentalist Christians about meditation, and you run up against this brick wall, this real rejection of meditation, this fear of it, and anger against it. And it won't be long before they say that the reason for this rejection is their belief that if you blank out your mind, the devil will come in. Right? Now, you might say to them, well, can you show me how to blank out my mind? I've been meditating for 30 years and I still haven't blanked out my mind, except on a few rare occasions. But deeper than that is this problem of the idea that the devil has not been overcome, that the duality has not been overcome by the cross and the resurrection, which is, it seems quite clear. I would, to most of us, is the whole meaning of the story of Easter. So we still got the devil around, running around in, as in the book of Job. And the book of Job begins, God is sitting on his throne, and the devil is there in his court, and God says, "So what have you been up to?" He said, "I've just been roaming around the world, causing trouble." So that image of the world as this dualistic battlefield between good and evil is still alive and strong in many Christian minds. Contemplation, of course, transcends that duality, but not without a struggle. It's a very deeply embedded view of the world. Not a happy view of the world. It keeps us locked in to its own narrow perception of reality. It fills us with fear and with the anger that accompanies fear. So it's not a very nice place to be, but I suppose prisons can be safe places in a way. I've met prisoners who have committed crimes in order to go back into prison because they were happier there than they were out in facing the challenge of freedom. Many Christians also are just deists. In other words, they don't really work on the model of God as a trinity, but as a single huge skyscraper, sort of, that rather than a community, which is how the Trinity is best understood, a communion, living the life of a community and generating a life that spreads out beyond the immediate community and brings other things into existence, brings about creation, in fact. It's only when we begin a contemplative practice, but also maybe some people get zapped by a contemplative vision of the world. Many children, I think, are zapped by this or slip into this mystical, if you like, vision of reality, as a unified field of great energy and great beauty and great harmony. But so some people just fall into this or slip into it by accident or have a moment of grace. But the vast majority need a contemplative practice to escape this dualistic trap. And then all of this begins to make sense. Until the experience of our true consciousness, our self-knowledge, begins to happen at a deeper level. Deeper simply means more integrated, more harmonized, more unified, more one. All of this is really just conceptual. Meditation, however, makes spiritual knowledge real and embodies it in daily life and experience at all levels, physical, mental, and spiritual. Many people find it difficult to say why they meditate. If they're asked this question by somebody who's curious, and they'll say, well, do you get really wonderful visions or wonderful experiences in your meditation every day? And those people would say, no. They say, do you find it solves all your problems? Well, no. So, what are you doing? Why are you just running away from the world? No, because it's quite a hard work often to meditate, although a joyful work. So, but perhaps the answer to why we undertake a contemplative practice and remain and grow more committed to its radical simplicity is that it is changing the way we see and relate to the world. There is a fundamental transformation, a transfiguration of our way of being in the world. And the little signs that give us the first clues, the first fruits of this, and they, I think, could be related to the sharing in the life of Christ, maybe the way we interact with each other in our families and our friendships or our workplace. I was meditating with a father and a son recently, just the two of them, and the father meditates very regularly. The son, a teenager, meditates when he feels like it. And anyway, we'd meditated together, and the father left the room, and the son said to me, Lawrence, I'd really like to thank you for teaching my dad to meditate. Said, we've all noticed the difference. And he said an interesting thing. He said, we all noticed it immediately, as soon as he began a regular practice. The father was a bit surprised when I told him this, but So, meditation makes all of this, what might sound rather abstract reflection, quite real, embodies it in daily life and in our relationships. I'd like to read a short paragraph from a 5th century, I think, Christian teacher called Diadicus of Photike. You may know it if you know the Philokalia. There's a section there called On Spiritual Knowledge. And this is what he says about our human journey beyond duality. All people are made in God's image. But to be in his likeness is granted only to those who through great love have brought their own freedom into subjection to God. Now, he didn't just write this in 3 seconds, I'm sure, so we shouldn't expect to understand it in 3 seconds, so I'll repeat it or paraphrase it. This distinction between image and likeness, something goes back to the first page of Genesis, and they actually mean the same thing, I think, in the Hebrew. So it's a little bit of repetition, of course, but it was picked up and developed as a way of understanding the process of human development, that we're all in God's image. Therefore, we should respect and love and reverence every single human being as created in the image of God. However, much we may look down on them socially, politically, financially, every human being is an image of God. But we are called to be in the likeness of God. So this is a way of describing divinization. So the purpose of this image of God, when it first gets made, is that it will grow through stages of human fulfillment until it becomes so like God that you can't tell the difference. That's divinization, which we've seen already is the sort of the ultimate meaning of life. So everyone is made in God's image, but only those can be in his likeness, can be like God, when, through great love, they have brought their freedom into subjection to God. And we don't like the word subjection. Maybe it could be translated differently, I don't know. But I think what it means is quite acceptable. It's really the struggle that we experience through our ego. The ego is very willful. The ego wants to do its own thing, see the world in its own way, impose its way on other people, including God. That's why our prayer, or certain forms of prayer, can be very egotistical. It's me, telling God, what God should do for me, basically. And even becomes even more egotistical when you think you can bribe God, or bargain with God, or some other way, twist God's arm, or go around his back and speak to his friends and ask them to ask him for things. So this is the ego. I mean, this is, I think, what we mean. But we're free. We're free to make ourselves. We're free to do what we like, more or less. So he's saying we actually can only become like God. We can move deeper into the divine being, be divinized, when through love we bring our freedom into subjection to God. So we say, okay, well, you are God after all, so I'll let you be the center of my soul. So what is love here? What is this great love that puts the ego into its right place in relation to God, makes us aware that we are revolving around God rather than God around us? Well, this great love is pure attention. What is our prayer except selfless attention to God? It's exactly the same selfless attention that we practice when we are compassionate to those in need, when we put other people before ourselves. It's the same attention. You could say it's the same love. That's why the Christian tradition has always understood meditation, contemplation as a work of love. It takes us to the source of love. We sort of bathe in the spring of love in meditation, and as a result of that, it changes our life because it changes the way we act, and think, and see, and feel. For only when we do not belong to ourselves do we become like him. So what happens when you don't belong, something doesn't belong to you, you've lost control over it. The lawyer says you don't have any rights over that piece of land anymore. It doesn't belong to you. So what does it mean not to belong to ourselves? The ego certainly doesn't like that idea. The ego is very proprietary and territorial. So the idea that we do not belong to ourselves, that we lose ourselves, is quite disturbing. Of course, that takes us to the radical discipleship of the gospel, the radical simplicity. So only when we do not belong to ourselves do we become like him who, through love, has reconciled us to himself. So we have to let go of ourselves. That's what we try to do when we meditate, and then we live out the consequences of the meditation in daily life. When we do not belong to ourselves, we can grow in likeness to the one, to Jesus, who, through love, has already reconciled us to himself. And then, there's a giving and a receiving of attention here. We can see the Easter story as the divine attention focused on the human with an intensity and a purity that has changed everything. When you receive pure attention from another person, it changes you. You have been loved. You know that you have been loved. So we could say then that the divine attention is focused through the lens of Jesus. Jesus is the lens that focuses the vision of God on us in a loving way. It's pure attention, so it's pure love. It's not manipulation. It's not conditional. It's just pure attention. And that touches us and begins to change us. And it also empowers us. This is the important, the first time we looked at this so far, but it empowers us. And this is the meaning of the Easter story, is not just that we are observers, but that we are empowered by this event. It touches us and it gives us something which changes us. And what it gives us is the capacity to return that love, to return that attention. We'll come back to that later. And then he concludes this little paragraph. No one achieves this unless he persuades his soul not to be distracted by the false glitter of this life. So no one achieves this, can enter into this process, unless he persuades his soul. So in other words, it's not just an intellectual choice. We have to learn it. What does it mean to persuade your soul? It means you learn something through a discipline. It takes time. It's like learning to meditate, or it's like learning anything truly human. So we persuade our soul, we learn how not to be distracted by the false glitter of this life. He's not saying by the beauty of this life or the joyful pleasures of this life, but the false glitter, the things that distract us. Okay, well we can follow through on some of that this afternoon. Let's take a few moments to stretch, and then we'll, after the meditation, we'll have a few minutes to look at some